Okay, so our next speaker is George Taylor. George, I mean, many in the Rickerian community who are with us here know him very well. He is an emeritus professor of law at Pittsburgh University. He is also known as, you'll forgive me, George, for saying this, but the founding father of the Society for Ricker Studies. He has always been very active in promoting Ricker studies in the Anglophone speaking world and beyond that. He was also, of course, the editor of Paul Ricker's Lectures on Ideology and Utopia, and now also the editor of the forthcoming for very soon for March next year, as George told us, of Ricker's Lectures on Imagination, which are coming out simultaneously in English and in French. So George, I'll give the floor to you for your talk on why ideology and utopia today. George.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay. And I'm certainly happy during the discussion to pick up on some of the conversation with Arto as well, and very useful transition between the two talks. So I'm going to read my paper, and I've got it on the screen here for everyone to be able to follow along as I proceed. So my title has at least two dimensions. First, why should we pay attention to the concepts of ideology and utopia today? Aren't they outmoded, with ideology a vestige of the Marxist thinking of a prior generation of thought, and utopia a romanticist and escapist notion? A second form of my question is, why should we pay attention to the discussion of ideology and utopia in Paul Ricoeur's book on that subject, his Lectures on Ideology and Utopia? Here, too, is Ricoeur's discussion outmoded. He spends 5 chapters of that text, after all, on Marx and another 3 on Althusser. Aren't the interrogations of those figures passé? Meanwhile, Ricoeur's discussion of utopia focuses on 19th century figures such as Saint-Simon and Fourier. Since I am, as Gonzalo mentioned, the editor of the Lectures on Ideology and Utopia, it is likely not surprising that I continue to find value in that text. I do have some ambivalence about whether the concept of ideology retains currency. Its connotation is generally pejorative, but whether or not we like the term, ideology continues to be, as I shall discuss, a significant placeholder for issues that remain quite vital. And I do want to emphasize the continuing importance of the concept of utopia as well. To establish the enduring vibrancy of the lectures, I will first undertake some steps to locate its themes within larger dynamics of contemporary discussion outside of Ricoeur's work, and then we'll return to the lecture's distinctive and decisive contributions to this understanding. I will also try to show why the lectures remain distinctive within Ricoeur's corpus and a fruitful subject for further research. I will situate the current significance of the lectures in 4 steps. I begin with some direct current responsiveness to the theme of ideology, and then expand to larger contextualization of the import of Ricoeur's work. First, then, it has been instructive to read the discussion of ideology in the recent work of the French economist Thomas Piketty, Capital in Ideology. Piketty gained an international reputation for his earlier book, Capital in the 21st Century, first published in 2013, and he has followed up with Capital in Ideology. The topic in both books is wealth and income inequality. It is quite striking in Capital in Ideology that Piketty describes inequality as at bottom not economic or technological, but instead ideological and political. The theme of ideology is for him not outmoded, but quite apt, as he pursues throughout his lengthy text. While not mentioning Ricoeur by name, Piketty's theory is supportive of Ricoeur's argument. Similar to one aspect of Ricoeur's thematic, as I shall describe later, Piketty defines ideology in a constructive sense as a set of ideas and discourses advancing how society should be structured. Relative power is not simply material or economic, but also ideological. The ideological sphere has autonomy. Ideas and ideologies count. This entails that many paths are possible given a particular economy. While our era may want to conceive of itself as post-ideological, in reality, it is saturated in ideology. Beyond Piketty's direct engagement with the theme of ideology, I offer three forms of contextualization that extend the theme more broadly and are quite germane to the implications of Ricoeur's thought here. All three of them show the dislocation of reason as foundational, and so engage in a critique of the sufficiency of the Enlightenment legacy. In the words of George Lakoff, to whom I shall return, we cannot understand 21st century politics on the basis of the model of an 18th century brain. The Enlightenment emphasis on the mind operating on the basis of reason and facts is insufficient. These three steps of contextualization will work from broad to narrow, and I start from the very general understanding of the brain articulated in recent decades in the field of what has become known as behavioral economics. Those resistant to economic jargon should not be put off by the reference to economics in this field. The main studies here lie in cognitive psychology. This work challenged the thesis of mainstream economics that we each seek to maximize our economic utility. Let me offer an example through some variations. Why do newspaper articles typically begin by focusing on the story of one individual affected by whatever the subject of the story is about, rather than about the larger class of those affected? Why do we categorize groups in a summary fashion? Muslim, woman, American, French. Why do people have in their head a sense of the normal person as white, male, heterosexual, and able-bodied? In all these cases, the research shows that we are very bad at statistical reasoning, instead think on the basis of prototypes. A story comes to life when we understand its implication for one affected individual rather than a statistical multitude. We tend to categorize quickly on the basis of groups and assumed norms. It would be much more rational and economic to think empirically and statistically, but we do not. So what's the point? The research indicates that the brain operates on the basis of two systems. System one is more automatic and instinctive. It operates unconsciously, proceeds on the basis of associations such as prototypes, requires no attention or effort, and functions quickly. System two, by contrast, is more reflective and consists of what we more typically consider a rational reasoning process. It engages in systematic evaluation, is controlled, takes conscious effort, and proceeds more slowly. For our purposes, it is essential to recognize that system one is the default system for the brain. System two engages only when necessary and often accepts system one judgments. Think of our average day. Much of our activity is undertaken automatically: dressing, eating, brushing your teeth, driving. We could not function if we had to deliberate about each of the thousands of decisions we make daily. System one also involves what we call in English gut reactions. Our stomach speaks. We have an emotive reaction, positively or negatively, to an event, and our response is colored by this non-deliberative emotional reaction. The system one functioning is typically effective and allows us to move forward, but it also acts on the basis of shortcuts, such as prototypes, and these can be inaccurate and dysfunctional. The implications of the interrelations of system one and two are both fascinating and tremendously significant. For its deep instruction, I commend an excellent and quite readable book on the subject by one of its proponents, Daniel Kahneman, called Thinking Fast and Slow. And I have the Portuguese translation in parentheses. In my view, everyone needs to know the basis of behavioral economics to understand better how the world works. But for our present topic, what is critical is the challenge of behavioral economics to the Enlightenment prioritization of reason. Instead, the mind works much more fundamentally on the basis of the intuitive, affective factors of system one. System two rationality is often more subordinate to the operation of system one. It takes us a lot of work to engage system two, to overcome any System 1 limitations. The second step in contextualizing the significance of Ricoeur's lectures moves us to the narrower framework of cognitive linguist George Lakoff. Lakoff is himself attentive to the dynamics of behavioral economics, but his major contribution lies in showing how the mind works primarily on the basis of metaphor. He is particularly famous for his work with Mark Johnson, Metaphors We Live By. And it may be of interest that Mark Johnson was a graduate student of Ricoeur at the University of Chicago. In Lakoff's extensive writings, he argues forcefully for the foundation of human cognition, not in the literal, but in metaphor. The emphasis here is similar to that in behavioral economics and prototypes. Metaphors, too, are typically unconscious and automatic and proceed on the basis of type rather than categories with clearly delineated boundaries. There are obvious resonances of Lakoff's work also with Ricoeur's on metaphor, a point of relevance to which I return. For present concerns, of a special interest is Lakoff's extension of his work on metaphor to politics. He criticizes the typical view that in politics, all that is needed is to provide facts and figures to show where people's interests lie, and people will vote accordingly. This approach, Lakoff maintains, ignores the cognitive unconscious, does not reach our deepest values, and suppresses legitimate emotions. Instead, he claims we need to embrace a deep rationality that can take account of and advantage of a mind that is largely unconscious, embedded, emotional, empathetic, metaphorical, and only partly universal. Lakoff insists that we cannot stick to policy and interest groups and issue-by-issue debate, but must attend politics' moral, mythic, and emotional dimension. It is this moral, mythic, and emotional dimension of politics that, I shall argue, Ricoeur's discussion of ideology in Utopia tends and deepens particularly well. The third and final step in contextualizing the lectures turns us to the social imaginary. Castoriadis, Ricoeur, and Charles Taylor are generally recognized as the leading thinkers on the social imaginary, although Ricoeur's work on the social and cultural imagination is more of subtext in the lectures on ideology than a well-developed theme. A new journal, the International Journal of Social Imaginaries, is proving to be an important locus for discussion on this topic. Attention to the social imaginary participates in the hermeneutic turn in the social sciences and elucidates how cultural configurations of meaning orient our encounter with the world and influence the formation of social institutions and practices. The social imaginary also emphasizes the social and creative aspects of the imagination, the ability to reform social institutions. In opposition to materialistic and quantitative reductions of reality, the social imaginary highlights the ineradicable quality of structures of meaning or of meaninglessness in social life. In the words of Charles Taylor, the social imaginary has a constitutive function. It is not ornamental, not epiphenomenal. The larger significance of the lectures on ideology and Utopia lies in their development of the symbolic mediation of action. I want to focus on this topic so that we can better determine how this theme can at once be integrated into the contemporary contextual factors just discussed, and at the same time illuminate the meaning of ideology and utopia. It is also essential to appreciate that the symbolic mediation of action persists as a theme in Ricoeur as he returns to it as an element of prefiguration, what he calls mimesis 1 in time and narrative. In fact, I want to start from an example of symbolic mediation that Ricoeur offers in time and narrative to help illustrate what the topic entails. Ricoeur writes that when we raise our hand, it is not simply a physical motion, but has meaning. As depending on the context, it can be interpreted as voting, greeting a friend, or hailing a taxi. The physical activity is never isolable from the meaning of the activity. The activity is symbolically mediated. The meaning of action is a language that can be read. Readers of Ricoeur will be familiar with the extensions of this argument. Action is a quasi-text that can be interpreted. In the lectures, Ricoeur indicates that he graphs his entire analysis of ideology on Marx's acknowledgement that there is a language of real life that exists before all ideological distortions. For Ricoeur, the symbolic structure of action is absolutely primitive and ineluctable. I return to the import of Ricoeur's insight for his theory of ideology, but want to remain for the moment with the larger implications of Ricoeur's thesis. He frequently reiterates in the lectures that the symbolic structure of action is ineluctable. He claims that a non-symbolic mode of existence, even a non-symbolic kind of existence, can no longer obtain. The world of human action, of human practice, must immediately have a symbolic dimension. Practice must have from the beginning a symbolic dimension so that it might have and received its own language. No social action is not already symbolically mediated. The import of this thesis for the larger inquiry into the nature of imagination is also telling. Ricoeur relates symbolic mediation with the imaginary. We would not be able to understand the notion of the imaginary if reality were not already symbolically mediated. There is a primary imaginary structure of our being in the world. The imaginary is constitutive of our relation to the world. The social imagination, Ricoeur writes, is constitutive of social reality. In turn, interpretation is not isolable from, but integral to human practice. It is so primitive that, in fact, it is constitutive of the dimension of praxis. Symbolic mediation, meaning, imagination, and interpretation are all interrelated and are all interrelated as integral to human action. The consequences of this thesis are immense. Human activity begins not in abstract logic or isolable fact, but in symbolic mediation. In the lectures, Ricoeur extends the argument into human activity beginning in rhetoric. We see similar threads across Ricoeur's corpus. In the rule of metaphor, Ricoeur hypothesizes that we begin in metaphor. Is there not, in Gadamer's turn, a metaphoric at work at the origin of a logical thought, at the root of all classification? In Time and Narrative, as previously noted, Ricoeur returns to the symbolic mediation of action and maintains that we begin in figuration, particularly prefiguration. To my knowledge, the secondary literature has little developed these subtexts across Ricoeur's work and their consequence either for Ricoeur's corpus on its own or for social theory at large. I will comment on these larger implications after incorporating Ricoeur's extension of these arguments for ideology. Ricoeur is quite direct that ideology and utopia are integrally connected to the symbolic mediation of action. Ideology and utopia, he writes, have ultimately to do with the character of human action as being mediated, structured, and integrated by symbolic systems. If symbolic mediation is ineradicable, so is ideology. A pre-symbolic and therefore pre-ideological stage of real life can nowhere be found. As readers of the lectures know, Ricoeur's main thesis is that underlying the distortive level of ideology identified and explored by Marx, there must be a constitutive level of ideology, a level of symbolization itself that can be distorted. If there were not symbolic mediation already at work in the most basic kind of action, there would be no symbolic structure that could be distorted. Ricoeur types the constitutive level of ideology as non-pejorative, one that seeks to preserve social and individual identity. Piketty's theory also attends this constitutive dimension. While the utopia too can have a distortive function as escapist, it has a constitutive role as well to help us imagine and bring to reality alternative futures. The utopia itself offers a form of identity, a prospective identity, something that we seek and are not yet. If the constitutive and distortive aspects of ideology and utopia relate to the symbolic mediation of action, so does the third component of ideology and utopia, its role as legitimation or as contestation of power. As Ricoeur relates, the process of legitimation lies within the level of symbolization. For many who participate in society, their engagement is not simply a matter of a social contract, of giving to the society in return for what is received, but depends on belief. The symbols and symbolic structure of a society, culture, or nation do not give rise simply to thought, but to belief. Acknowledgement that some in society may not believe does not negate the point that many do. And for many of those who do not believe in their society, this loss of belief is itself a troubling part of the legitimacy crisis. In the lectures, Ricoeur addresses the topic of legitimation in the discussion of Max Weber. Ricoeur observes that in each of the types of authority that Weber addresses, the legal, traditional, and charismatic, the leader's assertion of authority rests finally on the citizenry belief, Glauben. A system of power rests ultimately on our belief. If the ideology acts to consolidate and reinforce this belief, the Utopia offers a space to challenge this belief. I emphasize the interrelation between the symbolic mediation of action and belief. The deeper contributions of the lectures to the theory of ideology and utopia and to the nature of the social and cultural imagination can be aptly summarized in Ricoeur's response to Marx. First, as well known, Marx argues for a differentiation between an economic infrastructure and a superstructure of ideas. Ideas are an efflux of the infrastructure of material behavior. But Ricoeur maintains that Marx's allowance of a language of real life shows that the symbolic mediation of action permeates the economic infrastructure. The symbolic mediation of action is itself infrastructural, inextricable to human action. While distortive ideology may be contrasted with praxis, a more constitutive form of ideology, a symbolic mediation, offers an interconnection with praxis. Symbolic mediation, imagination, and interpretation go all the way down. Second, symbolic mediation involves a motivational model pertaining to our relation to structures of power, including belief, and this displaces Marx's causal relation between infrastructure and superstructure. The motivational model better founds the possibility of agency in human praxis. Third, Marx criticizes interpretation as fallow because it does not effect change. Interpretation remains caught in the superstructure of the world of ideas. In the language of Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Yet, as Ricoeur responds, the utopia is not simply a dream, but seeks to change reality. The fiction that is the utopian form of productive imagination does not remain in the air, but aims to shatter reality. Like ideology in its constitutive faction, it can act at an infrastructural level. I now want to pull back from specific discussion of the themes of the lectures to argue for their continuing vitality today. Piketty's book is an obvious example of its relevance, but I want to fold this positive recognition of the persisting role of ideology into the other three stages of contextualization that I discussed at the outset. I shall proceed in a reverse order. First, it is likely only too apparent that the lectures, irrespective of their focus on the precise topics of ideology and utopia, offer decisive contributions to the contemporary attention to the social imaginary. In fact, I would argue that Ricoeur's development in the lectures and elsewhere of the theme of the symbolic mediation of action goes significantly further than the work of Castoriadis and Charles Taylor in clarifying how the social imaginary operates. Substantively, the theme of the symbolic mediation of action is also hugely important. As I shall pursue in more detail when turning to the other stages of contextualization, it is an essential contribution of Ricoeur's to articulate that human culture is situated and begins in symbolic mediation, as Piketty endorses. We begin not with fact, reason, or quantification, but in meaning, imagination, metaphor, rhetoric, and yes, ideology. As I attempt to elaborate elsewhere, perhaps the best way to encapsulate Ricoeur's approach here is to relate it to his thesis in time and narrative. We begin in figuration. This seems a momentous reversal of the Enlightenment claim asserting the primacy of reason. As evident, there's much value in Ricoeur's analysis and lectures on the symbolic mediation of action that can be retained independent of any attention to ideology. for Ricoeur's work to be congruent with the current turn toward conceptualization of the social imaginary, should we drop the vocabulary of ideology? After all, Ricoeur acknowledges that ideology is persistently a polemical concept, and Charles Taylor insists that the social imaginary allows for a constitutive function, as he claims ideology does not. Even if Taylor does not incorporate Ricoeur's non-pejorative sense of ideology, do we not still give credit to what he means? Characterizing an approach as an ideology is typically an aspersion, a denunciation. As I adverted to at the beginning, I do think that the vocabulary of the social imaginary more easily allows for consideration of positive functions of social and political life than does the term ideology. It is difficult for ideology to shake its negative connotations. Nevertheless, I would urge that the terminology of ideology be retained and incorporated into the larger perspective of the social imaginary, because the concept of ideology contains values that are often missing or underplayed in the notion of the social imaginary. In part, ideology's weakness as polemical, as critique, is also its strength. Although critique of particular social imaginaries is not unknown, we seem more typically to conceive of the social imaginary as positive. It is creative, imaginative. But Nazism was also a social imaginary that was creative and imaginative, and we each have our own views on perverse social imaginary of various political stripes today. The conception of ideology retains the analytic lens that can perceive distortion. The conception of ideology is also attentive to the problematic of power and legitimacy, as an orientation to the social imaginary is often not. And the vocabulary of ideology typically presumes a coherence in approach, perhaps totalistic, that the social imaginary does not. The social imaginary may permit multiple such forms, whereas ideology may view themselves more in competition, each asserting its own view about the proper form of ideological coherence. Finally, while Ricoeur maintains that the major ascription of ideology rightly is political, he also appreciates that the characterization of ideology, including all of the above traits, can apply to other contexts too: economic, moral, aesthetic, religious, and so on. I would also suggest that Ricoeur's concept of the utopia be retained from the lectures, included into the perspective of the social imaginary. The utopian includes the possibility of historical change, as the social imaginary also often, but not necessarily, does. The social imaginary may be static. Retention of the utopian is additionally important in relation to how Ricoeur's corpus as a whole offers a resource for considering the social imaginary. If, as I have commented, Ricoeur not only continues to adhere to the notion of the symbolic mediation of action, but expands upon it in his development of the notion of figuration, the same persistence is not true in his reference to the utopian. The year 1975 marked the publication of La Métaphore Vive and delivery at the University of Chicago of the course lectures for the lectures on ideology and utopia and the forthcoming lectures on imagination. As Gonzalo mentioned, they're to be published in March 2024. This was a time period when Ricoeur emphasized the creativity and productivity of imagination. If Ricoeur's work on metaphor demonstrates that we're not caught in the prison house of language, his work in the two sets of lectures demonstrates similarly they were not caught in the prison house of contemporary social and political structures. This is a most important message today, in my mind, an essential and abiding contribution of Ricoeur's work here. In the contemporary context of increased scholarly regard for the social imaginary, then, I find much of value to be retained in the lectures on not only the social mediation of action, but on the more particular themes of ideology and utopia as well. I offered as a second potential contemporary context for the lectures Lacan's work on metaphor and his stress on the inextricability to politics of its moral, mythic, and emotional dimension. And then the third context with the insight from behavioral economics that our minds work primarily on the basis of the intuitive, affective factors of system one, while system two rationality is often more subordinate and interstitial. I want to treat both of them together. It is likely apparent that Ricoeur's elaboration of the symbolic mediation of action fits nicely with Lakoff's emphasis on the moral, mythic, and emotional dimension of politics. I would argue that both extend the intuitive, effective arena of System 1. System 1 informs not only systems of economic behavior or of categorization, such as prototypes, but also affect, emotion. And Lakoff and Ricoeur shows this affect extends to basic political and other beliefs. As I've discussed, part of the message of the symbolic mediation of action is that we begin not only in interpretation, but in belief. Importantly, this beginning in belief influences, at least as a default, each one of us, not just those poor voters we criticize for not making rational choices because they are emotional or ideological. Symbolic mediation is inextricable, and so is ideological mediation. Again, at least as a default. I say as a default, as there's some evidence we can train our system two rationality to reduce our ideological bias, but I am skeptical that such system two ever prevails over system one. Whatever the agreement with that judgment, I would still insist that we each begin as system one in affect, moral intuition, and ideology. Education and intelligence do not automatically insulate us from ideology or bias. Some would claim that education, in fact, allows us to construct more elaborate ideological pyramids. These effective values with which we begin are not necessarily negative. They may, in fact, be ennobling, but they're ideological nonetheless. An additional contemporary significance of the lectures then lies in their expanding the reach of system one intuition and affect into our beliefs as affected by the symbolic mediation of action. None of us is immune, a very humbling but illuminating insight. An additional abiding significance of this insight into the pervasiveness of ideology in the symbolic mediation of action is that it provides crucial understanding into the dynamics of contemporary politics. Systems of belief permeate our politics. In other work, building on Ricoeur, I've discussed these beliefs as political faiths or losses of faith, but I do not belabor that vocabulary here. Yet, consider the symbolic mediation of national identity contained in the following inscriptions in the United States. We find language about the sacredness of the US Constitution and the sacralization of our 1776 Declaration of Independence, something described as an American scripture. In recent French culture, Julia Kristeva writes of this incredible need to believe, a position that she adopts herself. The search for a political and cultural symbol is felt to be particularly freighted when the search may be in vain. The persisting role of belief is reinforced by its possible loss. In France, Pierre Nora led a project to locate the lieu de mémoire, the symbolic elements of the memorial heritage of France, and he posed whether their power or legitimacy persisted or has become disenchanted. To be more precise, we cannot understand contemporary politics if we do not view it through the perspective of the symbolic action, mediation of action, and the role of belief. A great insight then of Ricoeur's delineation of ideology as integrative is that it makes apparent that individual or social group identification takes place on the basis of symbolic values, and these symbolic values may diverge from economic criteria. No longer is economic reasoning necessarily basic to human identity. Other values may well hold integrative sway. Ricoeur's analysis of the symbolic mediation of action and its manifestations as ideology in Utopia continues not only to have significant value, but to deserve much greater appreciation for incisive understanding of contemporary culture and politics. In the final section of my presentation, I turn from the larger ramifications of the lectures and their analysis of the contemporary social imaginary to the text's distinctive contributions within Ricoeur's corpus. Along the way, I pursue some subjects in the text that the volume treats only briefly, whose implications are weighty and are left to us to engage and cultivate. At many levels, then, the lectures remain a rich source both for the themes that it does address and for the suggestive topics on which it offers but brief hints. My first point returns to my earlier comment that the lectures appeared at a signal time in Ricoeur scholarship, during the same year as the publication of La Métaphore Vive and the lectures on imagination. Throughout this period, Ricoeur is very attentive to the possibilities of creative and productive imagination. In the lectures, the Utopia offers the potential for shattering reality for creative and transformative imagination. This emphasis on the creative imagination recedes in Ricoeur's subsequent work, where the turn is more to the narrative as a recounting of a story or to memory and history. Much as I find great value in Ricoeur's later works, for me, his dedication in the lectures and other work of this period to the creative imagination and its social and political opportunities as Utopia marks a high point of his intellectual career. The lectures are also vital for establishing the availability of critique within hermeneutics, but arguing that the critique occurs on the basis of a juxtaposition between ideological and utopian views, a question and comment that was raised during the last discussion. So each engages in a critique of the limitations of the other. This juxtaposition offers a certain solution to the problem of judgment, but insists that no point of view exists outside the game. I find this insight very probing, and again would differentiate this stage of Ricoeur's thinking from later reflections, where in his adoption of the formal rule of moral universalism, he turns more Kantian and Habermasian, even as he integrates the formal rule with practical wisdom. Pulling back from the larger reign of Ricoeur's corpus, the lectures are also important for their interrelation with the lectures on imagination. I find it interesting, for example, that Ricoeur does not delve into the distortions of imagination in the imagination lectures as he does into the distortions of ideology utopia. The analytic framework of the lectures may prove useful to interrogate imagination more closely. The role of the utopia in the lectures is also meaningful as a point of comparison to what Ricoeur deems the highest form of productive imagination, the creation of a fiction. Both offer alternatives to present reality and both partake of the nowhere, which is the literal definition of the utopia. Internal to the lectures themselves, there's much that remains to be explored, evaluated, and extended. I'll offer just a couple examples. First, there seems to be some ambiguity in Ricoeur's discussion of utopia between its ability to shatter reality and its potential as imaginative variation. The latter, which builds on Husserl, projects possibilities, but ones that remain hypothetical. The utopia is shattering by contrast to suggest the realization of a new truth, not just a hypothetical that comes to life. Utopia's shattering seems more similar to the scene as a metaphor. We bridge to something new, while the utopia as imaginative variation seems more a matter of as if. Given my concern that in Ricoeur's subsequent work, he seems to give less weight to the productive imagination as utopian in the sense of shattering, it seems revealing that in time and narrative configuration, Mimesis 2 is described as the kingdom of the as if. There seems also much more to mine in Ricoeur's work on legitimacy. Is he accurate that all political systems cannot survive only on the basis of the imposition of force, but require legitimization, that is, citizenry belief? Is Ricoeur correct that in every political system there is a gap in level between the authority leaders claim and the belief in this authority offered by the citizenry? What explains the basis for this gap? Note that this question is different from how the surplus value of ideological legitimation seeks to fill this gap. Ricoeur's discussion of legitimation seems to focus more on its distortive side. Should there also be development of legitimation's goal to partake of an integrative ideology? Is citizenry belief as a factor in the symbolic mediation of action integral to even positive forms of legitimation? What is the import in Ricoeur's discussion of legitimacy of his emphasis on the role of motivation as distinguished from the causality of the Marxist model? Continuing riches may be discovered through critical examination of the lectures on its own, in relation to the remainder of Ricoeur's corpus, and in relation to broader contemporary topics such as the social imaginary. So thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Once again, perfect, marvelous talk, and that gives a nice sequence to what Arto just said. Okay, so again, Gelson, please go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank George for a very insightful presentation. I have two questions. The first one would be a repeat of the question I had in the previous presentation, because George's presentation seemed to put forth the Ricoeur's notion of utopia bringing the novelty and the innovation in social organization. And my question would be precisely, what is the role of the philosopher, the social scientist, the scientist in general? How does he work with utopia? Does he analyze novel cultural projects with their social claims and their moral claims, or can he be part of this creative process? And I don't know if you prefer to answer the question and I ask the other one, or should I ask both?
You can go ahead with both, thanks.
Okay, yeah. In regards to the notion of the shattering of utopia being different to the as if model, I would like perhaps some better elucidation of that, because I don't understand it so much. Because to the extent, there's an article, I believe, by Marianne Moyert that analyzes Ricoeur's notion of utopia in terms of a struggle for recognition. If we see a utopia as a project put forth by a perspective or pretense of identity as a claim for a form of recognition or a form of structural or of social structuration that gives credence to the claims of a particular identity, doesn't the as if already puts in challenges the prevailing social models to the point that it becomes a shattering in itself?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So let me take them in turn. First, in terms of the role of the philosopher, as I think the paper indicated at various points, I think one important aspect would be to say that the philosopher, the social scientist, is not immune from the pressures of ideology, of various forms of belief. And I think, and this was an essential theme that Ricoeur was trying to pursue in the lectures, and in particular, he focused on this in his discussion of Mannheim, for example, because Mannheim, his own theory, thought that he could escape the social scientist's role, and Ricoeur saying that's not the case. It's still true, though, that Ricoeur would say we are not simply caught in our ideologies, but there is the possibility of distanciation. And partly, I think this is, I thought Arto's notion of Ricoeur's detour, where a social scientist in the role of explanation can offer some a point of distance from the current culture, is very